Back, everybody, to another lecture here in History 1301. And the topic that we're going to be going over today concerns that of religion and reform that we see starting to develop by the middle of the 19th century within the United States. Now, so far up in class, what we've been focusing on is a chronological approach to topics that we see throughout U.S. history. However, today we're going to talk about a theme that begins to develop within America throughout the early 19th century, as many Americans were under the impression that society was changing for the worse. Not to mention they believed that they were beginning to go away from their original Christian values as a nation. And by the beginning of the 19th century, even before the War of 1812, we'll start to see that Americans are going to play a much bigger role in their religion, as they will be ignited by a religious revival movement known as the Second Great Awakening that will greatly transform American society and eventually will put them down the road to getting on a reform movement to reform American society from all of the change that we see develop within the 19th century. However, before we can talk about that religious reform movement, let's take a moment to talk about the massive change that we see develop in American society, both before as well as especially after the end of the War of 1812, that would help ignite this religious revival movement. Now, American society had profoundly changed after the War of 1812, largely because of the market revolution. And when we talked about this in a previous lecture, we started to see that the market revolution opened up for many Americans different markets, not only across the nation, but also across the world. Transportation was beginning to improve, and many Americans wanted to tap in to outside markets to generate profits. And a part of that market revolution, what we also started to see develop is America, after the end of the War of 1812, was looking to develop its own sophisticated manufacturing as well as industrial sector. And by about the 1830s, America was beginning to rapidly industrialize, transforming American life as we know it, to where we start to see that individuals moving into, say, the Lao system that we had talked about before, would begin to take on wage-earning jobs. No longer would they be self-sufficient farmers, and they begin to live in major towns or cities. And this was a trend that would develop all the way into the 20th century, to where we see Americans begin to move from the countryside to the cities. And as they moved into the cities, crime would be on the rise, naturally. We'll see things like gambling and prostitution would be widespread, something that will appall religious figures, as we'll see here in a minute. But along that change that we see with industrialization, Americans weren't the only ones who were beginning to migrate into American cities to take advantage of this rapidly industrializing economy. We'll also see during this period, by especially the 1840s, there will be a large number of immigrant groups that would begin to arrive over in the United States to fill in many of these jobs that were now being produced as a result of industrialization. Namely, the groups that would arrive would be that of the Irish, Germans, Swedes, British, Scandinavian, and later on in the 1840s, the Chinese, who would arrive in large numbers to take advantage of the American markets. However, these immigrant groups, when they arrived, they would not be welcomed as if they had arrived during the Washington administration, but rather they will be met by fierce opposition. Now, especially groups like the Irish as well as the German groups that were beginning to arrive over in the U.S., they were bringing with them their religion. Particularly in regards to the Irish, they were bringing over their Catholic religion. Now, why is this significant as well? Even though Catholicism is Christianity, we'll see that at the time there was a major divide between Protestantism and Catholics. And many individuals in the United States, seeing this new wave of Catholic immigrants arriving over the nation, they feared that they would try to make the nation more Catholic, to create eventually a monarchy to where the nation would respond to the Pope and rather to the American people. And this will give rise eventually, through this anti-Catholic sentiment, give rise to America's first true nativist movement. Now, there have been nativist movements up to this point in American history, but most of them had taken place during the colonial period. However, they would not be widespread. But by the 1840s, there would be a significant nativist movement that will emerge in the United States, to where they would look to enforce more restrictions on immigration, to raise the naturalization law to where you had to live in the United States for 21 years in order to become a U.S. citizen. And they also look to establish laws to where it bar any non-Protestants from serving in office, namely Jews as well as Catholics. And there were also outright calls for bans. Most notably, we see this against the Chinese out in the West, which would eventually culminate with the Chinese Exclusion Act. But nonetheless, we'll see that this nativist movement, while it's controversial at its time as well as up to this present day, it would gain significant momentum. And we'll see that this nativist movement could interrupt American politics, especially during the 1830s and the 1840s, when we see the old Republican Party go out and the new Whig Party begin to take shape. Now, the new party that will really emerge by the 1840s that was associated with this nativist movement will be that of the Know Nothing Party. Now, the Know Nothing Party, one, where they get their name is whenever they were asked about their platform, they'd simply say, I know nothing of this platform. But they will be truly a nativist party. They would look to create political clout and restrictions against immigrants that we see starting to arrive over in the United States in the 1840s. And they will become a major political force by the end of the 1840s, gaining significant support during presidential as well as midterm elections. However, by the 1850s, we'll see that this party will begin to die out, but during its heyday, it threatens to become one of the two major political parties. But the reason it will die out in the 1850s was because of the fact we see another major issue is beginning to dominate Americans' minds. That of the issue of slavery, which we'll talk about how the anti-slavery movement will emerge here a little bit later on. But anyways, these nativists, as they were emerging, even if they joined the Know Nothing Party or not, they were basically countering all this change that we see associated in American society. Not to mention, as we see nativists looking to bar Catholics from holding public office, many Americans fearing that there could be a Catholic takeover of the United States will call for a renewed religious movement. To once again call on America to instill itself in religious fever, to where they would back their own Protestant denominations, and with it combat Catholicism. And it will be in this atmosphere that we see the emergence of what's known as the Second Great Awakening. Now, the Second Great Awakening, you can trace back its origins all the way to the beginning of the 19th century. And it does take shape as a result of both the change that we see in American society as well as the American experiment itself. Ever since the founding of the Republic, there was this new amendment that was added to the Constitution that we've talked about before, the First Amendment. And I'm not talking about the right or the freedom to speech or the freedom of the press, but within that First Amendment, there was a freedom to practice religion. Freedom of religion. Now, why is that significant? Well, it's because it allows Americans to choose the religion that they want. And with the democratization trend that we see culminate with the Jacksonian period, as Americans were choosing their own politics, as the people were getting more involved in politics, it would go hand in hand with what we see in the religious atmosphere, as Americans were beginning to choose their own Protestant denominations, having that choice because there was no official religion of the United States. And through that First Amendment clause, they were able to do so. And they joined in large numbers trying to strike up old Christian moral values in changing American society. And it wouldn't be long that this movement would then call on these individuals who were joining the ranks of the church, whether it was for the Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and other churches. We would also see that these individuals joining these churches would also call for reform of American society, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But what's going to fuel the Second Great Awakening is largely going to be that idea of that democratization trend that we see that would translate over to the religious sector and what we call free will. Now, many of the preachers of the Second Great Awakening, many of these American ministers, they're going to be preaching teachings of free will, of individualism. Now, we saw these notions being preached during the First Great Awakening. However, there were still Calvinist groups that were still present within the United States even after the emergence of the American Republic. However, by the 19th century, the Calvinism of Puritanism was long dead with this movement. Now, with this democratization trend, since you could choose your own political or politicians, you could also choose your own religion. Many Americans will begin to express this. We'll see rapid denominational growth with groups like the Baptists, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and several other groups who have small theological differences. And what they would look to apply the principles of their group to American society to reform it as it was beginning to change. Now we'll see that the Second Great Awakening will impact Americans, whether they were living out in the countryside or in the American cities. Now, first, focusing out on the West, there was a major call for a religious revival movement at the beginning of the 19th century. Mainly because many Americans who were going out into the West, they were not attending church. They did not construct churches in their communities. Not to mention they were hungry for a sense of community, to connect with their neighbors. And by the early 19th century, with this hunger for religious fever, we see that American ministers, mainly circuit riders from the Methodist and Baptist churches, are going to go all throughout the countryside in the West and begin to conduct what are known as frontier revivals, to where tens of thousands of individuals from all across the countryside would meet as a community in you could say a large congregation, even though they wouldn't create a congregation, but they would witness sermons from very prominent circuit riders, many of which would get involved in politics in the years to come. And at one of these frontier revivals, as well as many of the ministries that you would see during this period, they would be preaching that idea of free will, that you have a choice at salvation. They would condemn them as sinners. However, if they put down their sinful ways, they could come and save themselves, achieve that salvation. Now, this is not a new idea today, and for those of you out there who are familiar with the Christian faith, this is something that's pretty regularly preached at the time today. However, back then, this was something radically new, and this is going to energize people. We'll see over the course of the next several decades, in the early portion of the 19th century, hundreds of thousands of Americans are going to convert to various Protestant denominations. They would have a very emotional experience at these frontier revivals as well, and tens of thousands of individuals will attend them. And we'll start to see that these denominations will begin to rapidly grow, mostly the Baptist and the Methodist churches. However, this movement will not just be contained out to the countryside. We'll also see that it would have a heavy impact on the cities, to where many American ministers believed were the cesspools of crime and sin. And particularly where you see American cities being targeted by this religious movement would be up in the Erie Canal region. Now, I don't know if I'd mentioned this last time when we talked about the Market Revolution, but the Erie Canal was constructed during that period in 1817. And once it was finished in 1825, it stimulates trade throughout upstate New York. Now, why is that important to the Second Great Awakening into American cities? Well, it's because with this trading route leading into the Great Lakes region, small towns like Syracuse, Buffalo begin to pop up all along it. It becomes, I don't want to say industrialized, but it becomes urbanized. And we see that there's a good deal of crime that was all across the Erie Canal: prostitution, gambling, drinking, and so on and so forth. And one minister by the name of Charles G. Finney believes that the region was ripe for conversion. He will go all throughout that region delivering a very similar message to the ministers that were out on the frontier, stating that these sinners in these cities, they could put down their sinful lives and come to Christ and achieve salvation. And this would have a tremendous impact as we see tens of thousands of individuals in these districts of the Erie Canal as well as Western New York begin to convert over to Christianity. Because now they were given this choice, something that had long been neglected before the 19th century. And we see it's to no surprise historians have described that the religious fever that sweeps over upstate New York would ultimately resemble as if a forest fire had went through, as the societies completely changed and they would become known as the burned over districts of upstate New York. Not to mention, as religious fever was engulfing much of New York, we'll also see that it would give, or this Second Great Awakening would give birth to other religious sects. And most notable of those groups that would emerge out of the Second Great Awakening that would look to create a kingdom of God on earth and reform American society and challenge these changes in American society would be that of the Mormon Church. Now, the Mormon Church is going to emerge in New York. Really, its origins trace back to 1823, when the founder of the Mormon Church, that of Joseph Smith, would receive a vision from the angel Moroni. And here, he would go out to the outskirts of his father's land, and he would find the famed golden tablets. He would then, over the course of the next roughly half decade, begin to translate this strange writing, as he called it, through another set of plates. And eventually, by 1830, he would construct what's known as the Book of Mormon, which he would then begin to publish, which put forth a New Testament, if you will, to Jesus Christ, who, after the resurrection according to Mormon theology, he had come over from Israel and went over to the Americas to preach to the Native Americans, mainly 3 families who had come over from Israel in a prior time. And it tells of that whole story. But anyways, also at the Mormon religion, it will become very controversial because the religion itself will begin to challenge many of these Protestant denominations that we see emerge in the Second Great Awakening. And for the first 2 decades, and even beyond that, of the existence of the Mormon Church, it would come under constant persecution. Eventually, Joseph Smith would have to leave the Mormon Church all the way out to Nauvoo, Illinois. However, when he arrives there, they still wouldn't be welcomed. After he creates somewhat of a dictatorship and institutes the practice of polygamy in the Mormon Church, non-Mormon authorities would arrest him, and then he would be assassinated. However, the Mormon Church would live on. They would go out into the territory of Utah, which at the time of their arrival was still a part of Mexico, but soon to be a part of the United States, and they would be led by Brigham Young for the foreseeable future. But they would emerge out of this religious fever during the Second Great Awakening. And American society, with these groups that were emerging, were also calling for reform to create, just like what the Mormon Church was promoting, a kingdom of God on earth, to outlaw sin, as we'll see in the coming days. Now, these groups that were emerging out of the Second Great Awakening, they're not going to be the only ones who are looking to reform American society. Most notably because we'll also see emerging alongside these denominations and these religious sects during the 19th century, we'll also see the emergence of utopian communities who likewise looked to reform American society. Now, these utopian communities, there are going to be hundreds of them that are going to begin to pop up across the United States, but while some of them are going to be influenced by religion, others are not. Most notably would be that of Brook Farm, which would be influenced by the transcendentalists, individuals who believed you should look to your inner spirit and to nature to transcend logic and reason, to explain things that could not be explained through logic or reason, things like emotions and so on and so forth. They would not be founded in religion, but the communities that they would create would be equal across gender lines and across color lines, race lines. It wouldn't matter if you're male or female, black or white, you would be treated equally in one of these societies, to where they promoted communal living, to where not one individual would own more land than everybody else, where everybody had a stake in their communities. Now, some groups, like the Shakers, would be based in religion, and other groups, like the Oneida community, will be somewhat of a mixture of religion as well as new beliefs being promoted by their leader. But nonetheless, the key factor of these utopian communities is they were looking to promote a more equal society. Now, many of these communities are going to fail. But when they begin to return home, those who had inhabited these communities, when they begin to return home, they would look to reform American society back at home, very similar to what we were seeing with Americans who were being impacted by the recent Second Great Awakening. And this is where the great aspect of this age is they're going to be focusing on reforming American society to either reflect the kingdom of God on earth or to become a more equal society that would live up to those expectations in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. Now, with the reform movement, many Americans who will embark upon this movement by the 1830s and the 1840s, they will be influenced by both these utopian communities as well as the Second Great Awakening. But particularly, Americans are going to be influenced by the Second Great Awakening when embarking upon this reform movement, to where they will look to outlaw sin. And one of the first reform movements that will emerge at the beginning of the 19th century that looks to outlaw sin is going to be that of the temperance movement. Now, the temperance movement in particular is going to target the sale, consumption, as well as the production of alcohol. Now, why are Americans challenging alcohol as a part of their form of outlawing sin? Now, first, as many are probably familiar with, within the Bible, getting drunk is illegal. And one of the main issues that America has, or isn't illegal, it's a sin. But anyways, one of the main issues that Americans have at this point is drinking. Now, the average American back during colonial America, as well as up to this point, drinks 3 times the amount of alcohol than their modern-day counterpart does today. To put it in more perspective, we'll see that one American historian would write that the average American would ultimately consume, back in the early 1800s, the equivalent to 4 ounces of hard liquor a day. So imagine today if you took 4 shots, and it's every single day. That was what they were drinking at the time, and as you could probably guess, there were a lot of drunk people. Now, why is this significant for many Americans as well, especially the religious reform movement? Well, it's because they believed that this rampant drinking was the root of all social ills. All crime, they believed, was based in some form with this consumption of alcohol. And therefore, if you could get rid of the drinking of alcohol, in their theory, crime would rapidly drop, gambling, prostitution would be virtually non-existent, and American society would be much more perfect. And so by the early 19th century, as the Second Great Awakening was beginning to take shape, it will impact this reform movement. We'll see most of those who would back the temperance movement would be American women who were having very changed roles during this period, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But anyways, with this group, there will only be really a limitation that they want to apply towards the drinking of alcohol. However, there was a group of absolutists, as we'll see with all of these groups, who did not believe that simply just putting a limit on the sale of alcohol was enough, but rather they would call for an outright ban on alcohol, and they called for a federal law to justify this. Now, with this portion of the temperance movement, it will begin to pick up steam, but the temperance movement itself won't become successful with that federal law until we get to the Prohibition era during History 1302 in the 1920s. But anyways, it emerges as a result of this reform spirit that comes out of the Second Great Awakening. The other major reform that we see emerge during this period is going to be that of the women's rights movement that emerges by the 1840s. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, but with the Second Great Awakening, with the organization of these frontier revivals and these ministries, we start to see that American women were beginning to partake in active roles. Most of the church memberships at this point were American women, and they have a huge say in church policy. Now, with that understood, we also see that roles for women were beginning to change in the American Northeast. They begin to become economically independent. In the Lao system, it was mainly American women who were the first industrial workers. And now at this point, as American women were beginning to earn their own wages, as they have more of a say within church politics, the only thing missing was equal rights. By the 1840s, as a result of a split within the anti-slavery movement, women will begin to actively seek equal treatment in society. Now, at this point, our basic understanding of how Americans' roles were in American society, even before the Revolution, we see that they were treated as second-rate citizens. While they were classified as citizens, they had virtually no rights. They could not vote. They could not hold public office, and they, in matters of divorce, they virtually had no say. And in many cases, they couldn't even own property. However, by the 1840s, individuals like Lucretia Mott, as well as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as well as the Grimmick sisters, are going to begin to rise up and state that women should have equal rights, that they should be allowed the right to vote, to participate in politics, and so on and so forth. And in 1848, their platform would become more radical as they pursued that last issue I mentioned, the issue of voting and participating in public office, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton would write what's known as the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, or better known as the Women's Declaration of Independence, to where she would call on women to gain the right to vote. But this was viewed as very radical, and we'll even see that that leads to a split in the women's rights movement. But nonetheless, it would be a fight that will continue on for the next roughly 7 decades. And over the course of the next 7 decades, slowly women would be granted the right to vote and some rights within America's political system. And eventually it would culminate by 1920 with a women's suffrage amendment. But there was still a lot of progress to be made. But that begins back in the 1840s. And it does center around the Second Great Awakening and the religious reform movements that we see at this point in American history. Now, the last major reform movement that I'm going to touch on is going to be that of the anti-slavery movement. Because many Americans, especially northern ministers, were beginning to recognize in their eyes that one of the greatest sins that we see in the nation, the greatest blight on the nation, was the institution of slavery, that they believed was morally unjustifiable. But the question is, with this anti-slavery movement, or I shouldn't say the question, the thing that y'all need to know about the early American anti-slavery movement, individuals approached it in very different ways. Americans ever since the founding generation who tried to achieve anti-slavery, trying to free the slaves, did so in different manners. And there will be 3 main ways on how Americans are going to look to end that institution of slavery and bring about reform and justice after almost 2 centuries of bondage. Now, the first and perhaps the most popular form of the anti-slavery movement that will be accepted by many Northerners as well as many Southerners would be that of colonization. Now, what the colonization movement was, is it really emerges by the end of the 18th century in the early days of the Republic. Now, the founding generation, they had believed that slavery was a dying institution, and ultimately a future generation would free the slaves. And they called the institution a necessary evil, one to which they did not have a clear answer to. And individuals like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, while they owned individuals in bondage, they could not produce their own way to free these individuals, even though they were saying that this was a horrid institution. But they would then, by the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, begin to be attracted by a growing colonizationist movement. Now, what a colonization movement was within the larger anti-slavery movement is it stated that the best way to free the slaves was to send them back to Africa in a colony that they established in Liberia off the West African coast. Now, this colonization effort will be fueled by 2 major motives by white Americans. One, there will be a very small minority who would support this because they believe that this is the best way to actually achieve this, and they will actually have a humanitarian view. However, the great majority of those who would support the colonization effort, individuals like Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, James Madison, and several others, the reason they supported the colonization effort is because they believed You could not free slaves from bondage and have whites and blacks in the same society. They believed it would lead to political chaos and that democracy would be destroyed. And so they would favor this colonization effort based off of views of white supremacy. Now, it will become very popular, and by 1820, we'll see the first of a series of ships would set sail to the Ivory Coast. However, there will be a lot of opposition back home, mainly from the free black community. Because one thing we need to understand, why these African Americans in the North who were out of bondage, why they're going to heavily oppose the colonizationist effort, is because to them, Africa was just as foreign as it was to white Americans. They had been born in the United States. They knew nothing else. This was where their culture, their customs were at. And they will engage in a series of riots against the colonization effort. And it's probably to no surprise that while colonization will become widely popular, there will only be a few thousand African Americans who would eventually arrive off in Liberia. Now, this leaves another issue. If colonization wasn't a feasible solution to slavery, what other options do Americans have? What other kind of sub-movements do you see develop in the anti-slavery movement? How else can you approach ending slavery? Well, perhaps an even more popular version of the anti-slavery movement over time that begins to emerge by the 1820s and 1830s would be the gradualist emancipation movement. Now, gradualism, or gradual emancipation, it calls for the slow freeing of slaves over the time. We'd see this back in the Missouri Compromise when it was one of the first times that it was proposed on the national scale, where James Talmadge Jr. stated that as a part of an amendment that should be added to the Missouri State Constitution, there should be no further importation of slaves into Missouri. And then after Missouri had entered the Union, after that date, everybody who was born to a slave family would be free. So slowly over time, the institution of slavery would begin to collapse. And many Americans, especially in the North, are going to begin to adopt this. Namely, Abraham Lincoln would be a major supporter of the gradual emancipationist movement. And when Americans try to resolve how they should end slavery, this is typically how they believe it should be done. However, this next group understood that gradualism did not essentially mean the death of slavery, but rather it delayed its death and it ensured its survival. And this last group, which will have the loudest voice, even though they would be one of the smallest anti-slavery groups, would be that of the abolitionists. Now, the abolitionists are going to be this group of radicals, of absolutists within the anti-slavery movement. They will call for an immediate end to slavery, under no conditions, to where all those slaves, 4 million in bondage, should be instantly freed. They would be led by individuals like William Lloyd Garrison as well as Frederick Douglass, who would push forth this movement calling for an end to this institution of slavery. And we'll see that black authors would also play a major role in this movement. I mentioned Frederick Douglass, but we'll see individuals like William Wells Brown, David Walker, and several others would be heavily ingrained in this movement, and they would be much more confrontational. However, while they will have the loudest voices in politics, and they will frighten the hell out of Southerners for years to come, it's important for us to recognize most Northerners are not going to accept abolitionism. Only 2% of Northerners are going to be abolitionists before the Civil War. But nonetheless, they will have the loudest voices, and they will impact American policy moving into the 1850s. But anyways, we're going to go ahead and end on that note, as we've talked about all the major reform movements that we see develop out of the Second Great Awakening. And next time when we come into lecture, we're going to be talking about the Old South, to talk about that institution of slavery, to see what it actually looks like on the ground. But anyways, as we wrap up this video, just like always, make sure you go out, read the required readings with this lecture. Also, make sure that you read the proper chapter in the textbook. And lastly, make sure you complete all outstanding assignments. But anyways, everybody go out, be safe. I'll see y'all next time.